Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. As you can see, the Doom Tower has reset and we are now into the Dark Fae Doom Tower. Of the 3 rotations of Doom Tower, my belief is that this is the most difficult. But that got me thinking about the difficulty levels of the bosses. And so in today's video, what I'm going to do is give you my personal tier list of Doom Tower bosses. I'm going to talk about which ones are the hardest to find solutions for in the easy game, and maybe which ones are the hardest to farm on auto battle in the late game. In addition, we're going to talk about all of the different solutions and maybe give you some insights on how to take on some of these bosses. So if you're curious about how I rank these bosses in terms of difficulty, and if that agrees with your opinion of those bosses, you should stick around. This should be a fun video. Let's get started. All right, before we go any further, just some quick channel business. I am still in the midst of my subscriber push. I'm hoping to get 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. So if you're interested in helping me out, make sure you hit the like button for this video. If you feel motivated, please add a comment as well. It can be a comment as simple as hi or thanks for the video, or if you have a question about the topic of today's video, that's even better. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and consider joining our Discord community. One last note. My live stream schedule this week is quite a bit different. I'm not going to be live streaming on Thursday because that's Thanksgiving here in the US. But I should be back for Sunday at 11 a.m. for our Noob vs. Pro series. Also, don't forget to hit us up every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our Takeover Tuesdays. Thanks so much for your help. Let's get back to the video. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was give everybody a quick rundown of the 3 different rotations of Doom Tower. Now here I am on hellhades.com, and if you go to the Raid Shadow Legends menu, you can see there is a Doom Tower section here. You can just go ahead and click on Doom Tower rotations, and this is going to give you a breakdown of each of the 3 rotations. Now the Hell Hades site does number them, but it doesn't really matter which one is which. They just always come in sequence, so the order will be the same every time. So as long as you know which one you are on, Dark Fae in this case, and the one that just passed, that was the Eternal Dragon, then you know which one is coming next. In this case, it's going to be the Frost Spider. So we are currently on rotation 3, Dark Fae, but rotation 1 is the Frost Spider Tower, and that'll be showing up next month. As you can see, there are 4 bosses in each tower, and they rotate. In this case, for the Frost Spider Tower, the reason we call it the Frost Spider rotation is because the Frost Spider is on floor 120, and this rotation of bosses is the same for normal Doom Tower and hard Doom Tower, so there's no difference between the difficulties. The 4 bosses here are Magma Dragon, Nether Spider, Scarab King, and Frost Spider, and as you can see, their affinities are also listed there. Now here we have rotation 2. It's the rotation that we just finished up yesterday, and that is the Eternal Dragon Doom Tower. Again, the Eternal Dragon here is the final boss on both difficulties, and the 4 bosses that we have to fight in that rotation are the Griffin, the Magma Dragon, the Nether Spider, and the Eternal Dragon. One thing I wanted to call out is that the Magma Dragon is in both rotation 1 and 2, as you can see, but here in rotation 2, it is Force Affinity. Up here in the Frost Spider rotation, rotation 1, you can see that the Magma Dragon is Magic Affinity. So there are 3 rotations. Each rotation has 4 bosses, which means there are a total of 12 bosses used. However, there are only 8 total bosses. So 4 bosses get used once, and 4 bosses get used twice. So Magma Dragon is used twice, as you can see, and any of the repeat bosses will change their affinity in between the 2 rotations in which they're used. So as you can see here, the Nether Spider is also used in rotation 1 and in rotation 2. And here it is Spirit Affinity in rotation 1. And then down here in rotation 2, the Nether Spider is Magic Affinity. Now rotation 3 is the rotation we are currently in. And as you can see again, Dark Fae is on floor 120, so we call it the Dark Fae rotation. And the 4 champions are Bommal, the Dreadhorn, the Scarab King, the Celestial Griffin, and the Dark Fae. In this case, the repeats are the Scarab King and the Celestial Griffin, and you can see that their affinities in this rotation are different than their affinities in the previous rotations. Okay, so here's my graphic to help us rank these Doom Tower bosses in order of difficulty. Now, before I get started, I do want to say that everybody's experience with these bosses will be different. So depending on which rotation was the first rotation when you joined the game, you may find that some fights are easier than I list here, or some are harder. Likewise, your roster matters, the luck of the rolls on your gear matters, and your investment in terms of the time in Doom Tower matters. Each of these bosses usually takes a specific solution to find, and so if you just don't have that solution on your roster, even one of the easy bosses that I list here can be very difficult. So remember that I am trying to rank these champions based on what I think the overall experience of the community will be in terms of facing them. I will be factoring in how easy it is to clear them the very first time and on your way up through normal Doom Tower, and also how difficult it is to put together a full auto team for farming them at the highest level. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually start ranking our Doom Tower bosses. Okay, so in 8th position here, I think for me at least, it feels relatively clear that there is one boss who is maybe a bit easier than all of the other bosses, both at the lowest levels and at the highest levels of Doom Tower hard, and that is the Magma Dragon. So I'm going to put the Magma Dragon here as the 8th most difficult boss. Now, if you're struggling with the Magma Dragon, the one thing you can probably look for that you may not be applying to your Doom Tower team is a provoke. If you can provoke this boss, it's the only boss in the Doom Tower that can be provoked. If you can keep this boss under a provoke 100% of the time, it is a relatively easy fight. And that's true all the way up. So just make sure that you have speed, accuracy to land your provokes, preferably a provoker that is not weak affinity for the rotations. Remember, there will be 2 different affinities for this boss. And if you have 2 provokers, that might even be better. But the solution for this boss is relatively accessible. In the early game, you won't even need a provoke. You could probably just power through the first few Magma Dragons. And then once you get up into Doom Tower hard, you can basically power through this dragon again, but having that provoke makes it a little bit easier. He's not a top floor boss in any rotation, so realistically, he's never that tough. All right, now that we've gotten the Magma Dragon out of the way, every boss on the list from here on up is actually relatively difficult depending on the roster that you have. You're going to need a specific solution in most cases. Like the Magma Dragon, if you come across almost any of these bosses in the first 40 or 60 floors of normal Doom Tower, you may be able to just power through on the sheer potency of your team. Like, you may just have champions and gear that overpowers the bosses, and you don't need any particular solution. That's not always true, but for some of these bosses, it will be true. But at some point, for every one of these bosses that remains, you're going to need to address the mechanics of the fight specifically in some way and build a composition or find a champion that's going to unlock this boss that you're fighting. Okay, so in my opinion, the 7th most difficult boss here is actually the Frost Spider. Now, this is kind of strange because this is a level 120 boss, floor 120. And at that level, if you are at floor 120 of either difficulty, the stat requirements are just greater than what you need for the bosses below it. So I don't want to say that this is a super easy fight, but in general, there aren't too many mechanics here you really have to worry about. You have to handle the minions in some way, and then you either need an HP burn or a block revive on the boss, or the boss will just revive indefinitely. I think that those 2 skills are relatively easy to come by, and the actual fight doesn't require them. It just requires that you have one in order to end the fight. So you can defeat this boss with almost any type of team composition. And that's why I think maybe it's a bit more friendly than some of the other bosses. Okay, so the 6th most difficult boss for me is Agreth the Nether Spider. Now, I do think that we're getting into the realm of needing very specific solutions, but I think that Agreth is not quite there, right? We're in an area of difficulty where you still need a good team composition, you need to understand the fight, but the roster is wide open. You can use a whole lot of champions to defeat this boss. So I think it's even a more wide open roster than for the Frost Spider, because there you need at least 1 HP burner or block reviver, and you don't really need anybody in this particular fight. I outlined in a video recently 6 different ways to build compositions for this fight. but the actual mechanics are a little bit trickier. The damage is a little bit more intense. And I would say you probably want at least one cleanser. Without a cleanser, it's going to be pretty tricky. You can find solutions that don't use cleansers, but they're all more difficult. So I think the easiest solution is still a solution that requires maybe at least one specific type of champion. So I do think the roster is wide open. There are a lot of solutions here, but each one's a bit trickier and the fight is a bit more finicky. Okay, now we're getting into some interesting territory here in the middle of the list. Now, one of the difficult things here is I think there are 3 bosses that all fit relatively close together in terms of difficulty. They're all a step up from the lowest 3 bosses, but it's hard to say which one is going to be more difficult depending on the roster that you have and where you are in the game. Specifically, which rotation do you start with? Just based on my most recent experience, I'm going to put the Eternal Dragon here at 5. We did just do this rotation, and I think that although this is a tricky boss and it can be difficult depending on your roster, there aren't too many very specific solutions that you need. Again, I think the roster is relatively wide open. The gear is relatively wide open. Because this is a floor 120 boss, it can be very difficult at that level. But I think on earlier floors, the solutions are relatively accessible. It's not a super tricky fight. It's about a medium difficulty fight in terms of the mechanics of the fight. So I'm going to leave him here at 5. All right, so now we come to the 4th most difficult boss in Doom Tower. And for this, I'm actually going to put the Scarab boss. Again, I do think you could potentially move some of these bosses around. The reason I decided to put the Scarab boss at 4 is because the solution is actually relatively simple, but it's not something that's accessible to everybody right away. The easiest solution for the Scarab boss is to get everybody on your team a blood shield ring. As long as you have a shield up when you hit the boss won't counter attack you. And even though it will speed the fight up to destroy the boss's health and have somebody in a destroy set or somebody with a destroy mechanic, you don't need that. All you need is time and sustain. So as long as you have blood shield rings, you basically should be able to beat this boss relatively easily. However, getting blood shield rings means CVC. You have to do CVC. And a CVC only happens every 2 weeks. You don't always get blood shield rings every time because sometimes you lose and you get no rewards. You also might get rewards that aren't blood shield rings. You also might get blood shield rings in factions where you don't need it. So it can be a while. It can take a while to acquire all the blood shield rings that you need. And so early on, Scarab might feel nearly impossible. There are a few champions that you can get access to in the game that would allow you to swap shields to make sure everybody always has shields up. You can potentially solo the boss. There are some cheese methods that you can use. But for the most part, there's one clear solution, and it takes a while to acquire that solution. But once you get to late game, this boss is a piece of cake. I never even think about this boss anymore on my main account because I have hundreds of blood shield accessories and I can put them on anybody that I need to put into this fight and clear this boss. So I actually do think the Eternal Dragon may be harder at endgame. I think the Scarab boss is so much more difficult in early stages that he can be a much larger blockade to your progress up Doom Tower. And so that's why I put him in 4 and the Eternal Dragon in 5. All right, so for the 3rd most difficult boss in Doom Tower, I am going to place the Griffin boss. Now, I think the Griffin boss could be 3rd or 4th or 5th, again, depending on your roster and your gear and when you started, what rotation was the first rotation you faced. I think the difficulty of the Griffin boss is that, again, it's a more tricky fight. It is something where you have to account for passives. You have to watch the skill rotations. You probably have to manual this fight more than any other fight that precedes it. And so I think from that standpoint, when you get up to the higher difficulty tiers or floors of the Griffin boss, this is a harder fight than anything that I've listed before. In the early game, you should be able to clear the first 1 or 2 Griffin bosses relatively easily before it starts to get too difficult. But like I said, at the upper levels, I do think this boss is harder than anything ranked below it. And that's why I've put the Griffin at number 3. Okay, now we come to the big 2. They are both in this rotation, and that is Bommal and the Dark Fae. And the second hardest boss in Doom Tower, in my opinion, is Bommal. And I think this is interesting because of all of the bosses in the game in the Doom Tower, Bommal is the one that has the most solo solutions. There are actually solo champions, epic champions in fact, that can be used to solo Bommal. But I think the reason that he's here at 2 is first of all because he is on floor 10 of the tower. So in the early game, you cannot proceed up the tower without a Bommal solution. And that is very frustrating. On my Noob vs. Pro account, this was the first rotation. I got to floor 10 and I never got past it in the 30 days or 29 days that the Doom Tower was active. I just did not have an early game Bommal solution, and that completely denied me all of the resources that I would get during the other 2 rotations by being able to climb up 40 or 50 or 60 floors. So as an early game obstacle, Bommal is by far the hardest floor 10 boss. That's absolutely true. Additionally, as you proceed up the tower, you will have to have very specific solutions for Bommal. Even though there are solo solutions, there aren't so many that everybody's going to have one. And as you progress, that the gear requirements, the stat requirements on those solo solutions go up and up and up. So let's say you have Burn Geary. Everybody should have Burn Geary now if you had Amazon Prime, because he was the free Amazon reward from last month. So if you have Burn Geary is a solo solution to Bommal, probably not all the way through Doom Tower Hard, but at least through Doom Tower Normal and maybe half of Doom Tower Hard. Above that, it gets trickier. And there are probably 3 or 4 solo solutions. The best epic is probably Lady Annabelle. There are also full team composition solutions that will be available. But regardless, you're going to have to build some champions specifically to address Bommal in a way that you don't have to really build specific champions for almost any other of these fights. Once you have that solution, I do think he's relatively easy to farm. It does take some time, especially if you have a solo solution like Lady Annabelle, because it'll probably take 10 minutes for her to win the fight. That being said, having a solo solution makes farming this boss almost the easiest boss to potentially farm, although not the quickest. Okay, and so that leaves our final boss here as Dark Fae, as the hardest boss in Doom Tower. It makes sense that a capstone boss, a floor 120 boss, should be the hardest boss in all of Doom Tower. Of the 3 120 floor bosses, I think Dark Fae is by far the hardest. She's also the hardest to create a full auto team for out of all of the 8 bosses. So in my experience, I was able to build a manual battle team for Dark Fae much sooner than I was able to build a full auto team. It was still hard to build the manual team, but once I figured out the team composition that I needed, and I started to actually tweak my team to make it work for Dark Fae, then it wasn't overwhelmingly difficult. The stat requirements, the speed requirements, the accuracy requirements at the top of Doom Tower Hard are very high, and that's another thing that makes Dark Fae very difficult at endgame. And then finally, actually creating the AI and the speed tune to take her down on full auto can be tricky without very specific champions. So I think in terms of the demands of a full team composition to beat a boss, this is the boss that requires that the most. In almost every other case, you probably only need 1 or 2 champions within a mix of a composition to take down that particular boss. But here, your whole team comp has to work well together. And so it's just more demanding. I do think there is some flexibility. There are some champions or compositions that are available to everybody, but it may take a while for you to put that together and actually take Dark Fae down. When you do, though, the rewards are great because she's got some of the best forged materials in the game. And in fact, if you look at this list, it's actually also a list in terms of the value of their forged materials. So I do think Dark Fae and Griffin are probably the bosses you're going to farm the most. Bommal, the Scarab boss, and the Eternal Dragon are probably the next most valuable. And then the 3 bosses at the end are probably the least valuable in terms of their forged materials as well. Okay, so that's it. That is my ranking of Doom Tower bosses in terms of difficulty. Let me know in the comments below how accurate you think my assessment is. Would you have mixed around that grouping of 3, 4, and 5? Would you put those 3 in a different order? Or do you in fact maybe think, for instance, that Bommal doesn't belong in the second spot, maybe Dark Fae doesn't belong in the top spot, maybe the spiders need to be a little bit higher up the list? So whatever it is that you happen to think, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinion on the matter. Okay, that is it for me. Thanks so much for hanging out. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and consider joining our Discord community. I've been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.